June 1943. The small town of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, northern England. Population, about 7,000 people. Textile mills, pubs, narrow streets. An ordinary English town that's about to become the site of one of the most dramatic racial conflicts of World War II. But this isn't a story about how racism flared up. This is a story about how ordinary people said no to it. A story about courage that doesn't require medals. A story about a night when British workers stood between American military police and black soldiers, risking their own safety. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back a few months. Spring 1943. Britain had turned into one enormous military camp. Hundreds of thousands of American servicemen were stationed across the country. They were preparing for the operation that would change the course of the war, the Normandy landings. The 1,511th Quartermaster Battalion arrived in Bamber Bridge. 1,700 men, all African American. They were housed in a camp near the town, Air Force Station 569, nicknamed Adams Hall. The battalion's task? Logistics, supply, transport, not combat. In the segregated American Army, black soldiers were rarely trusted to fight. They were used for grunt work. This was the reality of a segregated military. Nearly 10% of American servicemen in Britain were black, yet they served in units deliberately separated from white soldiers. The military brass believed this was necessary. They believed mixing races would cause problems. They couldn't see that segregation itself was the problem. The soldiers of the battalion came from the American South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, places where Jim Crow laws dictated every aspect of their lives, where they couldn't drink from the same water fountains as whites, where they couldn't sit on the same bus as whites, where they couldn't look a white person in the eye without risking violence. Think about what this meant. These men lived in a country that told them daily they were less than human. Signs everywhere, whites only, colored entrance. A country where a black man could be lynched for speaking to a white woman. Where voting was effectively impossible through poll taxes and literacy tests designed to exclude them. Many of them had never left America. For them, serving overseas was their first taste of freedom. They wore their country's uniform. They served the cause of democracy against tyranny. The irony was inescapable. They were fighting against Nazi racial ideology while their own country practiced its own form of racial oppression. But Britain greeted them differently. The locals saw simply soldiers of an allied army, not black soldiers, not inferior, just young men far from home, risking their lives in the war against fascism. British people had been at war since 1939. They'd endured the Blitz. They'd lost loved ones. They understood sacrifice, and they saw these American soldiers as comrades in that struggle. In the pubs, people talked to them. On the streets, they smiled at them. Girls danced with them at social evenings. For the first time in their lives, many of these soldiers felt like simply human beings. They could walk into a pub and be served without question. They could sit where they wanted. They could be called by their names, not slurs. One soldier would write home to his mother, "Mama, here they call me by my name, not boy, not you there, by my name." I'd forgotten what that felt like. Another wrote, "I wish you could see how people treat us here, like we're just regular soldiers, like we're Americans, not colored Americans. It's almost like being free." But this newfound freedom created a problem. American military command had no intention of abandoning segregation just because they were on British soil. The military's position was clear. Segregation wasn't just policy, it was necessary for order and discipline. To abandon it would be to admit it was wrong in the first place, and they weren't prepared to do that. American command issued a directive to British authorities and establishment owners. a request to practice voluntary segregation. Some pubs for white soldiers, some for black. The British reaction was unequivocal. Refusal. This needs to be understood correctly. 1940s Britain was no paradise of racial equality. The empire ruled colonies in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean. Racism existed. British society had its own hierarchies and prejudices, but there were no laws codifying racial segregation. There was no British equivalent of Jim Crow, and the British, especially the working class, found the American system both alien and offensive. George Orwell, observing American troops in Britain, wrote something revealing. The general consensus of opinion seems to be that the only American soldiers with decent manners are the black people. In the pubs of Bamber Bridge, resistance to segregation was clear. According to some accounts, handwritten signs began appearing. All who fight for freedom are welcome here. Some reports claim pub owners even posted "Black Troops Only" signs in defiance, though historians debate whether this actually occurred. What's certain is that Bamber Bridge's pubs welcomed black soldiers, and the locals made their position clear. White American soldiers, especially those from the South, were shocked. They saw British girls dancing with black soldiers. They saw local men drinking beer alongside African Americans, laughing, talking as equals. They saw British women dating black servicemen. This violated everything they'd been taught about racial order. Some white American soldiers tried to explain to the British how to handle black people. The reaction was cold. One British worker reportedly told an American sergeant, "Mate, we've been fighting for 4 years here against people who believe in racial superiority. We're not about to accept it from our allies." British women, in particular, refused to comply with American racial expectations. Barmaids would tell white soldiers to wait their turn when they tried to be served before black soldiers. Women danced with whomever they pleased at social events. This freedom enraged some white American troops. The 234th U.S. Military Police Company, stationed on the north side of Bamber Bridge, consisted entirely of white soldiers. Their job was to maintain discipline among American troops, but in practice, much of their energy went into trying to enforce racial segregation that British society refused to recognize. Tension was mounting. White American military police regularly patrolled the town, trying to control black soldiers. There were skirmishes. There were arrests. Locals increasingly witnessed the rough treatment of black soldiers by white military police. Then came news from America that would light the fuse. On June 20th to 22nd, 1943, just days before events in Bamber Bridge, Detroit exploded in race riots. The violence was savage. Federal troops had to be called in. When it ended, 34 people were dead, 25 of them black. Most of the black victims were killed by police. Over 1,800 people were arrested. News of Detroit reached the soldiers in Bamber Bridge. They heard about black neighborhoods burned. They heard about police violence. They heard that while they were overseas fighting for democracy, their families back home were being terrorized. The message was clear. Nothing had changed. Nothing would change. The tension in Bamber Bridge became electric. And then came the evening of June 24th, 1943. Thursday, a warm summer evening. The pubs were open in Bamber Bridge. After a long workday, people gathered to drink a pint of ale, exchange news, forget about the war for an hour. The sun wouldn't set until late. Summer in northern England meant long twilight hours. Several soldiers from the 1511th Battalion entered the pub Ye Old Hob Inn. Among them, Private Eugene Nunn. 23 years old, from Mississippi. a tall, quiet young man who never looked for trouble. He'd spent the day driving supply trucks to Manchester. Hard work. He was tired. He just wanted a beer and some conversation. They ordered beer, sat down at a table with local workers, talked about football, about the weather, about how they missed home. An ordinary evening. The kind of evening that had happened hundreds of times before without incident. Black soldiers and white locals, sharing a drink, sharing stories. Just people. Around 9 o'clock, 2 white American military policemen entered the pub. Corporal Roy Windsor and Private First Class Ralph Ridgway. Their eyes immediately fixed on the black soldiers. The atmosphere changed. Conversations didn't stop, but people noticed. Everyone in Bamber Bridge knew what the MPs represented. Everyone had seen confrontations before. They approached the table. One of the MPs, a corporal, addressed none. "Soldier, do you know this pub isn't for coloreds?" None looked at him, then at the pub owner who was shaking his head, as if to say, "That's not true," then back at the MP. "Sir, the owner didn't say anything about, I'm not asking what the owner said. I'm telling you. Pack up and get out. Now." The local workers at the table tensed. One of them, a textile mill worker, stood up. "Listen, mate, these lads are our guests. They're not bothering anyone. Maybe leave them alone?" The MP turned sharply to him. "This isn't your business, mister. This is a military matter. When it happens in my town, it's my business." The atmosphere in the pub changed completely now. Conversations fell silent. Everyone watched the developing scene. This was a moment of choice. The locals had to decide. Would they stay out of it, or would they stand with the soldiers? The second MP put his hand on his baton. "Soldiers, I'm giving you a final warning. Stand up and leave." The military police retreated from the pub. They regrouped outside. The sergeant called for more backup on the radio, but he also sent a message that would change everything. A message to military command that there was a disturbance involving black soldiers and that the situation was volatile. At the 1511th Battalion camp, 3 kilometers from town, soldiers heard that their comrades were being arrested and beaten in town. The rumor was exaggerated. There had been no beatings yet, but the tension of recent months, years of humiliation, all the accumulated pain exploded. Around 50 black soldiers made a decision. They were going to Bamber Bridge. Some armed themselves with rifles from the camp armory. They weren't planning to start a fight, but they weren't going to stand by while their brothers were arrested for drinking beer in a pub. This was the moment everything changed. What had been a local incident was about to become something much larger, something that would force the American military to confront the consequences of trying to enforce Jim Crow on foreign soil. 10:30 p.m. on the main street of Bamber Bridge, about 20 American military policemen had assembled. They had batons, pistols, some carried rifles. They were waiting for senior officers and additional forces to arrive. The situation had escalated beyond anything they'd expected. From the darkness at the edge of town, a group of black soldiers emerged. They marched in formation, military discipline still holding despite everything. Many carried rifles. Their faces were set, jaws clenched. These were men who had reached their limit. Years of insults, years of being treated as less than human, years of watching white soldiers given respect they were denied, years of knowing that back home their families faced the same degradation every single day. All of it converged on this moment, on this English street, on this summer night. The MP commander, a captain, stepped forward. "Soldiers, stop! Return to camp immediately. That's a direct order." The soldiers didn't stop. They kept marching forward. "Soldiers, I order you to stop. If you continue, this will be considered mutiny. Mutiny is a capital offense." Still they came forward. The threat of execution meant less than the demand for dignity. And then something remarkable happened. Local residents poured out onto the streets. About 200 people. Men, women, elderly people, even some children. They positioned themselves between the two groups of armed men. They weren't armed. They had no authority. They only had their voices and their courage. One of the locals shouted to the military police, "Lower your weapons. These lads aren't your enemies. The enemy is over there, across the English Channel." The soldiers reached the pub. Their comrades came out. They were fine. No one was arrested. The locals had protected them. But there was no relief. The tension had reached critical mass. Too many armed men, too much anger, too much history of injustice boiling to the surface. And then a shot rang out. To this day, it's unknown who fired first. Some accounts say a black soldier fired into the air. Others say an MP fired a warning shot. Some believe it was an accidental discharge, a nervous finger on a trigger in the darkness. But the result was panic. More shots. The sound echoed off the narrow streets, people running, shouting, diving for cover. The military police retreated to their jeeps, some firing as they went. Soldiers scattered through the alleys and side streets. Local residents rushed toward their homes, but many, remarkably, opened their doors and pulled black soldiers inside, hiding them. For the next several hours, Bamber Bridge became a war zone. Not real war. There were relatively few shots fired, most of them into the air or at buildings. But the atmosphere was one of siege. Armed men on both sides, fear and anger mixing in the darkness. Military police patrolled the streets in groups, searching for deserters and mutineers. Soldiers hid in houses, barns, shops, anywhere locals would shelter them. And the people of Bamber Bridge stubbornly refused to cooperate with the MP's searches. According to local accounts, one elderly woman hid 3 soldiers in her basement. When military police came to her door, she refused to let them search her home. The MPs, unwilling to force their way past a British civilian, moved on. Other families did the same. A textile worker hid 2 soldiers in his garden shed. A shopkeeper concealed soldiers in his stockroom. These weren't activists. They weren't radicals. They were ordinary people making an extraordinary choice, putting themselves at risk to protect soldiers who were being hunted by their own military. By midnight, senior American officers had arrived. British police were on scene. Negotiators tried to calm the situation. Slowly, very slowly, the tension began to ease. But the damage was done. Private William Crossland, 25 years old, from Alabama, was dead. A bullet had struck him during the confrontation. He bled out on a street in an English town, thousands of miles from home, killed not by Nazi soldiers, but in a conflict with his own countrymen. 7 others were wounded, 4 black soldiers, 3 white MPs. Most injuries were minor, but one MP had taken a serious shoulder wound. One black soldier had been shot in the leg. By morning, order was restored. Soldiers had returned to camp. Military police were recalled to their station. On the streets of Bamber Bridge, Residents cleaned up broken glass and collected shell casings. Business owners surveyed damage to their buildings, bullet holes in walls, shattered windows. But the real price was still to come. American military command was furious. Not at the racism that had caused the incident, not at the MPs who had provoked it. They were furious that it had happened at all, that it had gotten out of control, that their carefully maintained fiction of military discipline and racial order had shattered on a small English street. Such an incident couldn't be allowed to exist. It couldn't become public. It was a humiliation for the army, for the country, especially at this moment as they prepared for the greatest military operation in history. What would it say if the world knew that American soldiers were fighting each other, that the military couldn't even maintain order among its own troops? A military investigation began immediately, but its outcome was predetermined from the start. 27 black soldiers were arrested. The charges ranged from disobeying orders to mutiny and murder. Not a single white MP was arrested. Not one was charged with anything. The investigation didn't consider whether the MPs had provoked the incident. It didn't question whether trying to arrest soldiers for drinking in a pub was legitimate. It started from the assumption that the black soldiers were guilty. The court-martial proceedings were swift and conducted behind closed doors. Defense attorneys were white officers with minimal interest in actually defending their clients. They went through the motions, but the verdict was never in doubt. Witnesses from among the local British population wanted to testify. They wanted to explain what they'd seen, how the MPs had provoked the confrontation, how the soldiers had tried to avoid conflict, how the locals had witnessed everything. But they weren't permitted to testify. This was a military matter, they were told. Civilians had no place in it. One soldier received a sentence that could have meant death. Several got long prison terms with hard labor. The rest received various punishments: demotions, loss of pay, dishonorable conduct charges. The residents of Bamber Bridge were shocked and outraged. They wrote letters to their MPs, to newspapers, to anyone who would listen. The local member of Parliament raised the issue in the House of Commons, demanding that justice be served, that the truth be told. The British press tried to cover the story, but wartime military censorship blocked publication. Newspapers could only report that violence had occurred somewhere in northwest England. No details, no names, no truth. American command's position was unwavering. This had been a mutiny. These soldiers were criminals. Justice had been served. Case closed. But the people who were there that night knew different. They had seen black soldiers defending their dignity against a system designed to destroy it. They had seen men who were asked to fight for freedom being denied that very freedom. They had watched as courage was punished and injustice was sanctioned. The death sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment after British authorities intervened at the highest levels. But the soldier would still spend years in Fort Leavenworth Military Prison in Kansas. After the war ended, most of the convicted soldiers were eventually released early, but their military records were permanently stained. No honorable discharges, no veterans' benefits, no GI Bill to help them get an education or buy a home. They returned to an America that had changed little, that still didn't want to acknowledge what they'd sacrificed. Private William Crossland was buried in America. His death certificate listed the cause as non-battle death, as if what happened wasn't combat, as if racism wasn't a war being fought every single day. For decades, the story of Bamber Bridge was forgotten, deliberately. American military archives classified records of the incident. British wartime censorship remained in effect for years. Newspapers couldn't publish what they'd learned. Veterans couldn't speak freely about what they'd witnessed or experienced. The official military history had no room for this story. It disrupted the narrative. It revealed uncomfortable truths about American military racism. It showed that the fight for civil rights wasn't something that began in the 1950s and 60s. It was being fought all along, even on foreign battlefields. Surviving soldiers from the 1,511th Battalion returned to America after the war. They came home to a country that hadn't changed. Jim Crow was still the law in the South. Discrimination was still rampant in the North. They'd fought for democracy abroad, but couldn't vote at home. They'd worn the uniform, but couldn't get served in restaurants. They'd risked everything and received nothing in return. Most stayed silent about Bamber Bridge, some out of fear. They'd been convicted of mutiny after all. Speaking about it could bring consequences. Others, out of pain. The memory was too bitter, too raw. A few tried to tell the story, but found no one wanted to listen. America in the 1940s and 50s wasn't ready to hear about black soldiers standing up to white authority. But in Bamber Bridge, they remembered. Elderly people told their grandchildren about that night, not as distant history, but as something they'd lived through. They told about the soldiers they'd hidden, about standing between armed men, about the choice they'd made when choosing would have been easier. My grandfather was there, one Bamber Bridge resident would later recall. He told me he'd never been so frightened in his life, but he'd also never been so sure he was doing the right thing. In the 1980s, something unexpected happened. A maintenance worker named Clinton Smith was working in Bamber Bridge when he noticed bullet holes in a bank building. When he asked about them, locals told him the story. He was shocked. How could something so significant have been forgotten? Smith began researching. He tracked down documents, found survivors, interviewed witnesses. His work helped bring the story back into public consciousness. In the 1990s, historians began serious research. Military archives were finally declassified. Surviving participants, now elderly, began giving interviews. Academic papers were written. The truth, suppressed for half a century, slowly emerged. In 2013, on the 70th anniversary of the incident, the University of Central Lancashire held a major symposium on the Battle of Bamber Bridge. Historians, community members, and descendants gathered. They watched documentaries. They heard presentations. They ensured this chapter of history would be preserved and taught. In June 2022, a memorial garden was created opposite the pub where it all began. Not a grand monument, something modest, fitting for a town that had never sought glory for what it did. Just a quiet space to remember. Survivors of the 1,511th Battalion who lived long enough to see recognition of these events expressed similar thoughts. They had served in an army that didn't consider them equal, risked their lives for freedoms they were denied. But in Bamber Bridge, for one night, they experienced what it meant when ordinary people decided to stand for what was right. The story of Bamber Bridge isn't just about World War II. It's about the long, ongoing struggle for racial justice. It's about the courage of ordinary people, It's about the choices we make when injustice presents itself. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, eventually placed most of the blame for the incident on the white officers and MPs. He cited their poor leadership, their use of racial slurs, their deliberate provocation. He combined the black trucking units into a single special command, purged racist officers, and integrated the MP patrols. Morale improved. Courts-martial rates fell. But real change came slowly. The American military wasn't fully desegregated until 1948, when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. Even then, implementation took years. Even then, racism didn't disappear. It just had to find new forms. The story of Bamber Bridge reminds us that the fight for dignity has always been there, even when we don't see it in history books. It reminds us that ordinary people have always had the power to choose justice over comfort, courage over compliance. The residents of a small English town weren't perfect. They had their own prejudices, their own blind spots. But when forced to choose between accepting injustice and standing against it, they chose to stand. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for leaders. They simply stood between weapons and people and said, "Not here. Not in our town." The story of Bamber Bridge isn't a story about war. It's not a story about race in the traditional sense. It's a story about moral choice. The residents of a small English town weren't saints. They had their own prejudices, their own problems. But when they had to choose between the comfort of neutrality and the discomfort of doing the right thing, they chose the latter. They didn't ask permission. They didn't call a meeting. They didn't seek a leader. They simply stood between weapons and the people those weapons threatened and said, "Not here. Not in our town." And in that lies a lesson that transcends that time and place.